A prime minister whose answer to every social problem, dental care, childcare, pharmacare, school lunch, climate change, what have you, was always more socialism, more central planning, more top-down pronouncements, less freedom to make choices for yourself and your family.
Well, that was fast. The Liberals have faced their first loss in the House of Commons. We're going to talk all about that and the many theories and ideas that are floating around on the internet in regard to it. Also, Danielle Smith has to correct Mark Carney like he's a child and remind the world of the reality of which he is trying to hide, obviously. And according to the Liberals, being like China is a good thing. At least that's what they said yesterday during question period. I'm Jasmine Lane. This is Over Opinionated. Subscribe, follow, like, comment your thoughts down below, and share this video far and wide so we can open the eyes of as many people as humanly possible. Also, there's a newly elected Conservative MP that we absolutely need to talk about. First, though, if you needed proof that Jagmeet Singh sold his soul for that pension, well, here's all the proof that you need.
In Parliament, how do you feel about losing that vote?
Look, we're in a new territory. Canadians have elected a minority government with a very thin margin, depending on which parties may side with the government or with one another on any given vote. I try not to bake feelings into these things. They're math challenges, not problems with feelings. But we have to make sure that we do the work necessary to try to collaborate with parties across the aisle in order to implement the mandate that Canadians have given us.
Much to our surprise, as this has not been how the government has worked, the Conservatives did in fact put forth a motion demanding that the Carney Liberals present a budget or an economic update of some kind before House rises for the summer, which seems perfectly fair. There's a lot of people out there who will say, oh, well, Stephen Harper, he didn't give a budget until a few months later. Yeah, that is true. That does happen sometimes. However, the situation here, I would argue there's a lot of semantics, but I would argue that the fact that Mark Carney's Liberal team presented nearly $250 billion in spending without any oversight, without any details, without anything at all, right before they all go on summer break, yeah, you should probably have a budget. You should probably have an update. You should probably have something so that the taxpayers of whom that's their money know where this money is going. It would be even more ideal if that money could then be voted on in the House. And to highlight the blinking red sign over Jagmeet Singh's head and what he did by partnering with the Liberals as devout as he did in order to perhaps get his pension, in order to perhaps get something else. We don't know. This would probably be a good indicator because this hasn't happened in a very long time. Many, many years, in fact. On the vote details of this motion, the NDP unanimously voted in favor with the Conservative motion. Why? Well, because it makes sense. And yeah, the Liberals should be accountable with where they're spending our money.
Now, Prime Minister Carney said he wasn't going to produce a budget at all this year, then said he would do it this fall. And then he tabled a bill with $500 billion in spending. Now, this is extraordinary. He said he was going to cap increases to government spending at 2%. This is an 8% increase. It also sees massive increases to consultants outside of government. I want you to think Arrive scam when we talk about consultants. So we need accountability. We need to see what's happening with this $500 billion. Is this more inflationary spending? And is that why the Carney Liberals don't want it scrutinized by parliamentary committees and by members of parliament from all parties? So this is a big win, and it's important. This is an important test for the new Prime Minister because he doesn't have a majority. So will he meet the deadline and get this budget in front of parliamentarians this spring?
I am willing to bet that the Carney Liberals, in fact, do have a budget. I can almost guarantee it, actually, that there is a budget with all the details in it. They just don't want to present it.
You know, sometimes you don't know what you have until you've lost it.
A couple of important things to note with this, though, is this motion is non-binding, which means that Mark Carney is not legally required to produce a budget. However, if he fails to do so, that could lead to some distrust. That could also lead to a wild summer vacation for him of all kinds of theories and narratives being crafted when he's not in the House to address them. Also, they could produce a budget and then spend way above what that budget is. None of that is illegal to do. It would just make him look bad. The biggest thing about this motion and the fact that it passed with the votes that it did is the political pressure associated with it. And if Mark Carney does in fact fail to meet the deadline and produce an economic statement of some kind or a budget, that could indeed trigger a confidence vote, which there's tons of conservatives who are like, yeah, let's do it. Let's go back to the polls. Let's get the conservatives in. Unfortunately, just looking at the data, just using my brain a little bit here, this is my interpretation of it. I actually think a confidence vote right now, which could trigger an election, would be horrible for absolutely everybody involved. I actually think that it would leave the conservatives with even less seats than they currently have. There's certainly risk for that because Mark Carney is still in the honeymoon phase. He has still been relatively untested. His voter base are very strong about him right now. And I would also add that election fatigue is incredibly real. And so another election so soon could backfire really, really bad. Let's also factor in the money. Like, it was upwards of $1 million a day during the election campaign that we just had. I don't think any of the parties really have a ton of funds left over in order to do that well. Though, if Mark Carney keeps on dodging budgets, he keeps on lying, and he keeps on dwindling away the leadership of which he told everybody he was going to have, only to then show the exact opposite, I would then say that you could turn that into a referendum, and that could be very beneficial for the Conservatives. It's just too soon, in my opinion, for that.
And now the Prime Minister refuses to table a budget because he plans to rewrite the books. New books, everybody. He will override well-established public sector accounting principles. He'll take out capital dollars because they're not real dollars. We don't pay interest on them. We don't add them to the debt. Abracadabra, and boom, Canada's operational budget will balance itself. Speaker, I started out as a commercial and bankruptcy litigator. The first thing you ask when you enter a distressed company, show me the books. But when the books are hocus pocus, you bet there's malfeasance. You hear a company doing a big accounting revision, you dump the stock. Separating capital and operational expenditures never worked. It's been tried and failed. The Prime Minister should be honest about his government's failure. Fess up to the gazillion schmazillion dollar deficit. Do not cook Canada's books, because mark my words, it will undermine confidence in our country and it will bankrupt our nation. Please, do not cook Canada's books.
But guys, Mark Carney was elected because he is a world-renowned banker and economist. He is truly the best, and he's going to save our country. I mean, look at Doug Ford and how he describes him.
This has been the best meeting we've had in 10 years. Simple. Best meeting I've had in 7 years. And there was no expectations that the Prime Minister was going to come out and say, you get that project, you get that project. It was a great discussion. I described him today as Santa Claus. He's coming, and his sled was full of all sorts of stuff. Now he's taking off back to the North Pole. He's going to sort it out, and then he's going to call us. So, and we're building a short of Santa Claus is my big belly. I got to loan it to him.
Prime Minister Mark Claus over here is going to, maybe it should be Mark Klaus. He's going to unleash Canada's resources, right? I mean, just listen to what he has to say about Canada becoming an economic superpower.
Including some initiatives which involve decarbonization.
Smith, perhaps you'd like to respond. If I'm understanding correctly, Prime Minister, you are saying that you would fast track a project involving decarbonized oil through pipelines, decarbonized energy.
Before we get into Premier Danielle Smith's absolutely incredible response to this question, and also the answer that Mark Carney just gave, let us consider the fact that everything Mark Carney just said is so very deeply flawed, as Canada is a minor global emitter. You know what's kind of interesting too is they always say, oh, we're going to switch to solar, to wind, EVs are the best. Do you want to know who produces all of those things, manufactures them? them? That's China who does. And it takes an awful lot of oil in order to produce all of those things, from the petroleum-based plastics that they use to the natural gas as their backup generators, or the diesel trucks and manufacturing tools that they use to make all of this stuff in China. And China, by the way, is about 30% in terms of the total global emissions as recorded by country. So even if Canada went to net zero tomorrow, there'd be zero measurable effect on the global climate. Absolutely none. In fact, Environment Canada's own models have shown that even under extreme domestic carbon cuts, global temperatures would not change at all. Why? Well, because while China is emitting about 30% of all of this stuff, Canada emits about 1.5% of global CO2 emissions. And then in order to achieve less than 1.5%, which is already one of the lowest across all nations, we're then going to produce and manufacture and import all of these things, i.e. wind and solar, from a nation who's already one of the highest emitters. Again, in which all of the manufacturing process, from mining to transport and production, uses and completely depends on oil, natural gas, and coal. You know, it's one of those things that's just so crazy to me is they keep saying, oh, it's the future. Green energy is the future. But actually, green energy is built on top of natural gas, oil, coal, all of those things. And P.S., a full decarbonization, while first and foremost being relatively useless, it includes things like replacing all gas-powered vehicles. You have to retrofit buildings. You got to shut down oil and gas, massive subsidies for green tech, electrifying absolutely everything. And then we're going to end up in a situation similar to what Germany has, or worse. The cost roughly is about $2 to $3 trillion over about 25 years, and the burden of that cost falls on taxpayers, homeowners, small businesses. Let us again highlight Mark Carney's end goal with this prime ministerial role, which is that it's all about power and central control. It has absolutely nothing to do with the climate. In fact, when he says decarbonization, what he actually means is just outsourcing emissions to other countries, i.e. China, because that's where they're going to go. What does Mark Carney want to do? Clearly, well, he wants to redefine global capital under a climate emergency. He also wants digital carbon tracking, climate-linked currencies, as well as social scoring via ESG. And the reason why he is pushing this, why he pushes for a justified big government in order to pull all of this off, more spending, more control, it's really just to shift blame for economic decline to climate. And so he could say something. Justin Trudeau actually said something like this right before he resigned, where essentially it's like, oh, you're poorer, your life is harder. Oh, well, gosh, that's just the cost of saving the planet for our future. But unfortunately, me, Santa Claus Mark, doesn't actually care, because all of my investments, my millions of dollars, are in all of these things that I'm going to mandate, all of these things that I'm going to force the public without a consensus or a need from the public, by the way, but just because I tell them that this is what we're doing now because it's so important, not because I have any data to back it up, quite the opposite, but because I tell you it's important. I'm going to get richer because of all of this, and we're going to centralize everything, and I'm going to profit and make all of the rules so that I can profit the most.
And is that something that Premier Smith, that you agree with, or do you feel that we need to get the bitumen out of the ground now as soon as possible?
Well, let's call it the grand bargain, that we know that there is a group of oil sands companies that have been advocating for some time for what they call the Pathways Project, that would decarbonize the production of their bitumen through the use of carbon capture, utilization, and storage, ultimately using hydroelectric or small modular nuclear to decarbonize, and then direct air capture for the last mile. I think the point I was making to the Prime Minister and my colleagues is that there's lots of ways to decarbonize, but the Pathways Project is an expensive project. It would cost anywhere from $10 to $20 billion to get built. And to make the economic case for that, having more egress with more barrels to be sold to Asia is the way to pay for it. If we had a 1 million barrel a day pipeline going to the northwest BC coast, that would generate about $20 billion a year in revenues. And so that seems like a pretty good value proposition if both of those projects can proceed at once.
And note how Doug Ford, who is a con liberal, is sitting right beside Mr. Carney, by the way, and Danielle Smith, who is arguably one of the biggest powerhouses that we have in this country in terms of premiers, who is so articulate, so intelligent, and knows what to do here. Note how she is sitting off to the corner. Why? Well, because she's being ostracized, because she doesn't agree with the narrative. She knows that what they're doing is wrong. It's not about left or right. It's about right or wrong. And what they are doing, what they are proposing is wrong.
Minister Carney, can you spell out with some detail how exactly projects will be chosen for the list and by when, and when will we know about them?
So, several things. First, there will be review. The projects, we discussed a number of projects today. They're in various stages of preparation. They're in various stages of preparation. I think there's a shared understanding based on our discussion of the main criteria for consideration. I listed them. They're in the communique. I'm not going to repeat them given interest of time. We will work with project proponents on assessing projects relative to those criteria. As those criteria are increasingly well understood, in the national interest, Indigenous participation, example, advancing clean energy, material benefits to Canadians. As those are increasingly well understood, building the resilience of Canada, strategic economy of Canada, autonomy of Canada, more projects will come forward. It's not like the gate doesn't come down all of a sudden. Projects will also fall by the wayside because they won't necessarily meet all those criteria. It's a living list, but what's being clear is what's being put in place, or what is being proposed, will be proposed in legislation, is the ability of the federal government to devote the right resources to these projects, to make quick decisions about those projects that respect our environmental responsibilities, other responsibilities.
And before people start saying, oh, well, you know, she only cares about Alberta, it only benefits Alberta, that's why she's wanting to do it, take a listen to this.
I think sometimes Canadians will hear this debate and say, well, that might be of benefit to Alberta, but what about my region of the country? What do you say to that?
Well, if Northern Gateway had been built, it was a 595,000 barrel a day project. Canada would have benefited to the tune of $59 billion. That's how much revenue would have flown to the federal government, and provinces would have gotten $72 billion worth of benefit. Lots of that going to Alberta, but also with the spin-offs to all of the different provinces as well. That's a lot of money that can go to build a lot of schools and hospitals and roads and infrastructure. And so that's what is the foregone revenue because that project didn't get built when it should have. When we look at that, along with Energy East, along with Keystone XL, it just magnifies it. We could have by now had 2.5 million barrels per day more of production. That's $55 billion worth of GDP value. And the split, again, we benefit at the provincial level almost as much as the federal government does. So when the federal government is able to get those dollars, they're able to share them in the rest of the country. And that's part of the value proposition about why we want to see those projects built. It's even getting more so as we start talking to each other about, well, if we need to build 42-inch pipe, where can we get that from? Who can produce it? Right now, I think there's only one place in Canada that can. So why don't we find a way to retool our factories so we can build more of the products that we need for those major projects in-house. And that's, I think, the really constructive conversation that's now happening across the country, is that if we have an American partner that doesn't want to buy our products anymore, how do we buy more from each other? And I think that that's going to be the other way that we have additional benefits.
And if you too have been called a conspiracy theorist, a far right, a radical, not because you're saying something that's just crazy. People can brush off something that's crazy because it's crazy. It's pretty easy to recognize and to discern that from truth. But because it was weaponized by governments and security agencies, intelligence agencies, primarily in the United States, we actually saw a huge uprise of this after RFK's situation. And it was to shut down uncomfortable truths. So when the far left liberal government calls conservatives conspiracy theorists, just remember the playbook of which they are using, which is to shut you up, to ostracize you instead of proving you wrong, because they don't silence lies, they silence threats. And here is just a little bit more proof of exactly how far gone the liberal government is when you have Melanie Joly bragging about how China and Canada are the only countries in the world that have this in common. Well, that and also censoring news from their citizens.
Mr. Speaker, We know that we need to make sure that we fight back with strong counter tariffs against this rhetoric coming out of the White House. But you know what, Mr. Speaker? Our strategy has been working. There's only 2 countries on earth that have put counter tariffs against tariffs by the Americans, China and us. And by the way, today the U.S. Chamber of Commerce said that this threat of 50% tariffs in the steel and aluminum sector was completely unacceptable. We will work with our allies within the American society, and we will make sure that we fight back.
You know, if Canada and China have things in common, it makes you wonder what side of history the Canadian government is proud of and wants to be a part of. And that is where I want to give massive credit to a newly elected Conservative MP, Matt Strauss. He's from Kitchener-Hespeler, Ontario, and he actually used to be a doctor. So doctor, member of parliament, Matt Strauss, whose family has a deep history in dealing with communist regimes and dealing with socialist regimes and the downfall of that, and what it was that led him to decide, I'm going to give up being a doctor so that I can pursue politics because something is so very wrong in this country.
When farming is socialized, you get bread lines, and people died of starvation while standing in Soviet bread lines. When healthcare is socialized, you get lines in the ER, and I promise you people have died and are dying in waiting rooms, in emergency rooms across this country right now. You might think that I'm being overwrought and seeing the ghost of communism where it does not exist. However, I would note that we just spent 10 years with a prime minister who, when asked which government in the world he most admired, stated the basic dictatorship of the Communist Chinese Party. A prime minister who released a statement lionizing brutal communist dictator Fidel Castro when he died. A prime minister whose answer to every social problem, dental care, child care, pharmacare, school lunch, climate change, what have you, was always more socialism, more central planning, more top-down pronouncements, less freedom to make choices for yourself and your family. The zenith of all this top-down control came during the pandemic. The members opposite went full communism. They locked Canadians down in their homes. They ruined weddings, funerals, Easters, proms, and Christmases. They closed the borders. They kept mothers from children and brothers from sisters. They deprived this House of its ancient rights. They spent $600 billion of taxpayer money with no budget, doubled our national debt to pay healthy 16-year-olds to sit in their basement. Then, as now, they did all this in the name of crisis management. Physicians, professors, and journalists who spoke out against these abuses were hunted down. They had their licenses and their jobs threatened. I know this because it happened to me. At Queen's University, where I taught, Jane Philpott herself, one of the only 2 cabinet ministers to speak truth to Justin Trudeau's power, informed me in her dean's office that the reason the administration had to harass me was that I criticized the government. That is a direct quote. Of course, the Prime Minister and his commissars were immune from all of this. He could attend gatherings of greater than 5 if it suited his political purposes, like a George Floyd protest in Ottawa, and he did. Mr. Speaker, the Liberals claimed onto themselves the power to censor the news, to violate free speech in the name of fighting misinformation, while they themselves promoted misinformation. They gave luxurious contracts to their friends in academia to promote their misinformation. They gave hundreds of millions of dollars to mainstream media to promote government narratives. These 3 institutions, government, media, and the academy, have important roles in society to regulate each other. But under the federal government's bribery scheme, they have ended up, like the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker, out to sea, stewing in each other's bathwater. When ordinary, everyday Canadians came here to Ottawa complaining that their charter rights to bodily autonomy, assembly, and free movement were being violated, every member of the Liberal caucus voted to trample their rights further. They violated Section 2 and Section 8 of the Charter in imposing the Emergencies Measures Act. It is not me saying that, but Justice Mosley of the Federal Court. They trampled on the charter rights they claimed to revere, and then they laughed about it. The current Minister of Transport, in particular, laughed about it, Mr. Speaker. If we cannot speak truth to their power, everything will continue to break. And that is why I had to come here, Mr. Speaker. I refuse to be a cog in their broken machine. I hope it is the case that this darkness left with the former Prime Minister, and I beseech the new Prime Minister to turn to the light, to defend those values enshrined in our anthem, truth, strength, and freedom. I read his book, Mr. Speaker. The book was called Values, and freedom, I'm sorry to say, is not among those therein discussed. The repackaging of their socialist plans in bankers' socks might fool some of the people some of the time, but I will tell you who it is not fooling. It is not fooling the multicultural communities in Kitchener South Hespeler. The Romanians, Albanians, Polish, Ukrainians, Serbians, Croatians, Lithuanians, Venezuelans, Chinese, Somalis, and Ethiopians with lived experience of socialism who know what they are seeing and don't like it and sent me here.
You know, I'm actually not seeing anything at all in here about freedom either. What I am seeing, though, is a lot of stuff about control and controlling your money and adding lots of scary words like crisis. That is all for me today. I'm Jasmine Lane. This is Over Opinionated. Be sure to subscribe, follow on other platforms, as well as comment your thoughts down below, like the video, share the video, everything you can do, not for me, but just to help get these ideas, this message, these truths, these facts out to as many people as humanly possible. Because in Canada, thanks to a lot of the government overreach, our algorithms are manipulated, our news is manipulated, and it is very freaking hard to actually find the truth because we are quite literally blocked from it in some cases. So spread the message loud and far because we have a lot of work to do to compete against the government machine, the mainstream media machine that is working against us so that everybody involved can get their paychecks on the heels of your hard work and suffering, of course.